I was never the kind of person to get involved in neighborhood drama. I liked to keep to myself, mind my own business, and live peacefully. That's why, when I inherited my grandfather's old property, I saw it as a blessing. It wasn't a fancy house, just a simple structure with some much-needed repairs, but it sat on a decent chunk of land, several acres of open space, bordered by trees, and most importantly, free from the suffocating grip of an HOA. Or so I thought. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning out the old place, fixing what I could, and making plans for renovations. It felt good to be working with my hands, reclaiming a piece of my family's history. But then, I met her, Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. She wasn't my direct neighbor, thank God, but she lived just down the road in a gated community run by one of the strictest HOAs in the county. I didn't think much of her at first. The first time we met, she showed up at the end of my driveway, watching me with a polite but forced smile. At the time, I assumed she was just being friendly, so I walked over and introduced myself. She gave me that kind of look that made me feel like I was being judged before she even opened her mouth. "Oh, you're the new owner," she said, drawing out the words like she had already made up her mind about me. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I thanked her and went about my day, assuming that would be the end of it. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. First, there was the constant presence of HOA newsletters left in my mailbox, even though I wasn't a part of their association. Then, there were the comments, subtle at first, about how my property could use some tidying up or how it was a shame that it didn't match the aesthetic of the community. And then, the real trouble started. One afternoon, I was working outside, cutting down some overgrown bushes near my fence, when I saw Karen again. This time, she wasn't alone. She was standing with two other women, pointing at my property and whispering among themselves. I waved, trying to be polite, but they turned away as if I wasn't worth acknowledging. Something about it unsettled me, but I brushed it off and continued my work. The next morning, I found a letter taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, though I wasn't even a member, stating that my property was in violation of community standards. According to them, my fence was an eyesore, my grass was too long, and my house needed a new paint job to match the neighborhood's visual harmony. I laughed at the ridiculousness of it. My house wasn't even within their jurisdiction, and yet they were acting like they had any say over my land. I decided to ignore it. But ignoring Karen was a mistake. A few days later, I was walking my property line, double-checking the boundaries when I noticed something strange, Karen standing just outside my fence, taking pictures. She was snapping photos of my yard, my house, even my truck in the driveway. I called out to her, asking what she was doing, but she just turned and walked away like she hadn't heard me. It was unsettling, but still, I let it go. Maybe she was just nosy, or maybe she had too much free time. Either way, I wasn't going to let some HOA busybody ruin my peace. But then, the trespassing started. One evening, I was inside when I heard voices near my fence. I looked out the window and saw two men standing near my property line, talking and pointing toward my land. They weren't from around here, and when I stepped outside to confront them, they acted like they were caught doing something they weren't supposed to. Karen said it was okay, one of them stammered, looking nervous. She said this was technically part of the HOA's common area. I was floored. Not only was she sending people onto my land, but she was actually telling them it belonged to the HOA. I told them in no uncertain terms that they were trespassing and needed to leave immediately. They apologized and hurried off, but by now, I knew this was something more than just neighborly concern. Karen was up to something. The final straw came when I found a letter in my mailbox. Unlike the previous notices, this one was different. It was an official complaint, stating that my property had been annexed into the HOA and that I needed to comply with their regulations, immediately. That was when I knew this wasn't just Karen being annoying. She was trying to take control of my land. And I wasn't about to let that happen. I wasn't about to sit back and let some entitled HOA president claim my land as her own. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I knew I had to take action before things got even worse. The first thing I did was go through my property documents again, double-checking that everything was in order. Sure enough, the boundaries were clear, and my land was in no way part of the HOA. It was legally mine, free and clear. But Karen clearly didn't care about legalities. She had an agenda, and I had no doubt she would do whatever it took to push it forward. The next morning, I drove to the county office and requested a copy of the official property maps. I wanted to be armed with every piece of evidence possible when I confronted Karen and her ridiculous claims. The clerk looked at me strangely when I explained what was happening. Apparently, this wasn't the first time someone had come in with a complaint about an overreaching HOA. That only confirmed my suspicion that Karen had done this sort of thing before. But what shocked me the most was when the clerk casually mentioned that a request had been submitted weeks ago to review my property's status regarding the HOA boundary. That's when it hit me, Karen wasn't just harassing me. She was actively trying to take my land. I wasted no time. Armed with my documents, I went straight to the HOA office, ready to put an end to this nonsense. But when I arrived, I wasn't surprised to see that Karen wasn't there. Instead, I was met by a receptionist who looked uncomfortable the moment I mentioned my name. She didn't say much, only that all property concerns needed to be addressed through formal communication. I wasn't about to let them hide behind bureaucracy, so I left them with a written statement of my own, one that made it clear that my property was not part of their HOA and that any further attempts to claim otherwise would be met with legal action. That should have been the end of it. But Karen wasn't the type to give up so easily. That evening, I caught her on my security cameras again. This time, she wasn't just taking pictures. She had 2 men with her, and they were standing near my fence, pointing and discussing something I couldn't hear. It was clear they were measuring something. That's when I realized exactly what she was trying to do. She was attempting to justify her claim by making it look like my fence was on HOA land. I wasn't about to let that happen. I stepped outside, making my presence known, and just as expected, Karen and her lackeys quickly retreated before I could confront them. The next day, another letter showed up at my door. This one was more aggressive than the last, stating that I was in direct violation of HOA guidelines and that failure to comply would result in fines. Fines. For my own land. I couldn't believe the audacity. It was one thing for Karen to send her little notices, but now she was outright trying to intimidate me. I knew what she was doing. She was hoping that I'd be scared enough to either comply or sell the property altogether. But she had underestimated me. I wasn't about to be bullied off my own land by some entitled HOA president. Later that evening, I decided to make sure everything on my property was in order. I walked the entire perimeter, checking for any signs that someone had tried to tamper with the boundaries. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A section of my fence, one that had been perfectly fine the day before, had been deliberately damaged. The wood had been partially torn away, and there were fresh boot prints in the dirt nearby. Someone had done this on purpose. There was no doubt in my mind who was responsible. I immediately checked my security footage, and sure enough, there it was, clear as day. Karen and the same 2 men had returned in the middle of the night. One of them had used some kind of tool to pry at my fence while the other took notes. Karen stood there watching like she owned the place. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was destruction of property. I knew I needed to call the police. This had gone way beyond annoying letters and boundary disputes. This was criminal. I dialed the non-emergency line, explained the situation, and within half an hour, a deputy arrived at my property. I showed him the footage, half expecting him to shrug it off as a neighborly dispute, but to my surprise, he took it seriously. He asked me if I wanted to press charges, and I didn't even hesitate. I wanted Karen to know that she wasn't untouchable. The next morning, just as I was sipping my coffee and getting ready to head out, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. I stepped outside to see 2 police cars parked in front of my driveway. For a split second, I thought they were following up on my report. But then I saw her, Karen, standing off to the side, arms crossed, smirking like she had already won. I barely had time to process what was happening before an officer approached me, informing me that a complaint had been filed against me. I couldn't believe it. Karen had actually called the cops on me. And for what? Standing on my own property? I stood there, completely dumbfounded as the officer explained that Karen had reported me for trespassing. On my own land. I couldn't even process the absurdity of the situation for a moment, but I knew better than to lose my temper. Taking a deep breath, I asked for clarification, and the officer, reading from his notes, stated that Karen had claimed I was illegally occupying community property and causing a disturbance to the neighborhood. It was almost laughable, except for the fact that she had managed to waste police resources on her ridiculous scheme. I gestured around me, motioning to my house, my fence, my land, all legally documented as mine, and calmly explained that Karen had no authority over my property and that her allegations were not just false, but entirely baseless. The officer, to his credit, didn't immediately jump to conclusions. He asked if I had any proof of ownership, and I was more than happy to comply. I went inside, retrieved my official property documents along with the county maps I had obtained, and handed them over for him to review. As he scanned the papers, his expression shifted slightly, and I could tell he was beginning to see exactly what was going on. Still, he had a job to do, so he asked if I had any footage of Karen trespassing or attempting to manipulate the property lines. That was when I knew things were about to take a turn in my favor. I pulled up the security footage on my phone and played the clips of Karen and her associates damaging my fence, taking photos, and sneaking around my property at odd hours. I could see the realization settle in as the officer watched, the clear evidence of her actions contradicting every single accusation she had made against me. He sighed, nodded, and after a moment, walked back over to Karen, who was still standing there with her arms folded, looking smug, as if she expected me to be handcuffed and hauled away. That smugness vanished almost instantly when the officer informed her that my property was, in fact, legally mine and that I had every right to be on it. He then brought up the security footage, questioning her about her presence on my land and the damage to my fence. I could see the shift in her demeanor, the way she suddenly looked uncertain, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled to find an excuse. She tried to say that she had simply been ensuring that community standards were upheld, and that she had been under the impression that my land was subject to HOA guidelines. The officer was having none of it. He made it clear that not only was she mistaken, but that her actions could be considered trespassing and vandalism. He warned her that if she continued harassing me or interfering with my property, I would have every right to press charges, something that was already in motion thanks to the damage to my fence. The moment those words left his mouth, Karen's entire demeanor changed. Her face turned red, and for a second, she looked like she was going to explode. But then, in an act of sheer entitlement, she doubled down, insisting that the HOA had a right to enforce their rules, even on non-members, and that my refusal to cooperate was a threat to the harmony of the neighborhood. That was it. I had been patient, I had tried to handle things the right way, but I was done listening to her nonsense. I turned to the officer and calmly stated that I would be filing a formal harassment complaint against Karen and that I wanted an official record of her false accusations against me. That was when she realized she had pushed too far. She tried to backpedal, saying that it was all just a misunderstanding, that she hadn't meant to cause trouble, but it was too late. The officer told her in no uncertain terms that she needed to leave my property immediately and that any further attempts to interfere with my land could result in legal consequences. I watched as she stormed off, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she muttered under her breath about ungrateful neighbors and how this isn't over. But the truth was, it was over. She had played her hand, and she had lost. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, I felt a sense of relief. I wasn't naive enough to think she would give up entirely, but now, I had the law on my side, and more importantly, I had proof that she had been the one breaking rules, not me. Over the next few days, I made sure to document everything. I reinforced my fence, installed additional security cameras, and even put up a few more "no trespassing" signs, just to make it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate any more of Karen's antics. I also followed through with my complaint, filing an official report with the local authorities. It wasn't long before word started spreading through the neighborhood about what had happened, and to my surprise, I started receiving messages from other residents, people who had also been harassed by Karen and her overreaching HOA. It turned out, I wasn't the first person she had tried to bully into compliance, but I was the first one who had fought back with undeniable proof. The HOA board, once fully supportive of Karen, started distancing themselves from her, realizing that she had taken things way too far. I even heard from one of the board members, who quietly admitted that they had been growing tired of Karen's tactics but had never had solid proof of her overstepping her authority. Now, thanks to my footage, they had exactly that. And then, the final blow came. A few weeks after the incident, I received a letter, not from Karen, but from the HOA board itself. They were formally apologizing for Karen's behavior, making it clear that she had acted without authorization, and informing me that she had been removed from her position as HOA president. Apparently, my footage, combined with the harassment complaints from other residents, had been enough to force her resignation. I won't lie. It felt good knowing that she had finally faced consequences for her actions. But what felt even better was the fact that I finally had my peace back. No more letters, no more trespassing, no more ridiculous accusations. Just me, my land, and the knowledge that I had stood my ground and won. I hadn't wanted a fight when I moved here. All I had wanted was to live in peace, to mind my own business and be left alone. But when Karen tried to take that from me, I had no choice but to push back. And in the end, it was her own entitlement, her own arrogance, that had been her downfall. Now, every time I step outside, every time I look at my land and know that it's truly mine, I can't help but feel a little sense of satisfaction. Because no matter how much someone like Karen might try to take what isn't theirs, there will always be people like me who refuse to let it happen. With Karen out of the picture, I thought I had finally put the nightmare behind me. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. There were no more unexpected visitors on my land, no more ridiculous notices appearing on my door, and no more Karen lurking near my fence with her clipboard and fake smile. For the first time in months, I could focus on what I had originally intended, improving my property and enjoying my space without interference. I spent my days repairing the fence, planting new trees along the boundary to create an even more solid divide between me and the HOA community, and making sure my security system was fully updated. I wanted to be certain that if anyone tried anything again, I would catch them in the act. But despite my best efforts to move on, something still didn't sit right with me. Karen had been removed from her position as HOA president, but I knew people like her didn't just accept defeat. She had spent so much time and energy trying to take control of my property that I found it hard to believe she would simply walk away without trying to get the last word in. My suspicion grew stronger when I started noticing subtle changes around the neighborhood. The HOA community, once pristine and obsessively maintained, seemed to be unraveling at the edges. A few residents had stopped keeping their lawns in the perfectly manicured state that Karen had once enforced with an iron grip. Fewer cars were parked neatly in driveways, and for the first time since I had moved in, I actually saw people outside their homes, talking freely without the usual forced pleasantries. Then, I received an unexpected visit. One of my neighbors, a man named Tom who had never spoken to me before, knocked on my door late one evening. He looked uncomfortable, almost nervous, as if he wasn't sure he should even be there. He hesitated before finally explaining that he wanted to thank me. At first, I didn't understand, but then he admitted that he had been one of the many homeowners bullied by Karen. She had fined him for minor infractions, harassed him over the color of his mailbox, and even tried to force him into costly home modifications that weren't actually required by HOA bylaws. But since she had been forced out, the board had started loosening its grip. People were starting to realize they didn't have to live in fear of unnecessary fines and violations. Hearing that only confirmed what I had suspected all along. Karen hadn't just been a problem for me. She had spent years exerting her control over an entire neighborhood, using her position to intimidate and manipulate people into following her every command. And now that she was gone, people were finally seeing just how toxic her influence had been. But as much as I wanted to believe that her downfall had been enough to put an end to her interference, I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it in my gut. Karen wasn't the type to let things go, and I had a sinking feeling that she was still lurking, waiting for an opportunity to strike. That feeling was confirmed one afternoon when I noticed something strange on my security cameras. A car had pulled up near my property, just outside the HOA boundary. It wasn't parked in a driveway or in front of a house, it was just sitting there, engine running, with someone inside. I zoomed in on the footage, and my suspicions were immediately confirmed. It was Karen. She wasn't doing anything. She wasn't trespassing or taking photos this time. She was just sitting there, watching. I didn't react right away. Instead, I kept an eye on the cameras, watching to see if she would get out of the car or attempt to pull one of her usual stunts. But after nearly an hour, she simply drove away. It was unsettling, but I refused to let it shake me. I told myself that maybe she was just bitter about her defeat, that she had come to stare at the land she had tried so hard to control as some last pathetic attempt at holding on to her lost power. But then, the letters started again. This time, they weren't from the HOA. They were anonymous, unsigned, with no official letterhead or return address. They were printed messages, brief but clear, telling me that I should reconsider my decision to keep my land private, that I was preventing the neighborhood from expanding, that I was holding back progress. They weren't outright threats, but there was something menacing about the way they were worded. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly who was behind them. Karen was trying to intimidate me again, but this time, she was being more careful. She wasn't using official HOA channels anymore because she had lost that power. Now, she was resorting to anonymous harassment, hoping that she could still make me bend to her will. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. I documented every letter, saved every envelope, and even upgraded my cameras to catch anyone approaching my mailbox. I refused to let her play her games in the shadows. Then, one night, everything escalated. It was just past midnight when my motion detectors went off. I checked the camera feeds and saw something that made my stomach tighten. A figure was standing at my fence, partially obscured by the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching my house. My heart pounded as I zoomed in on the grainy image. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I didn't need to. I already knew who it was. Karen. She wasn't with anyone this time. She wasn't hiding behind her HOA position, her fake friendliness, or her board members. She was alone, standing at the edge of my property in the dead of night, staring at my house like she was waiting for something. I didn't hesitate. I called the police immediately. I wasn't going to play this game anymore. I wasn't going to let her think she could intimidate me into submission. This time, I was making sure she faced real consequences. The police arrived within 15 minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness as they pulled up to my driveway. I watched from my security monitor as they scanned the area with their flashlights, moving toward the fence where Karen had been standing just minutes earlier. But by the time they reached the spot, she was gone. I wasn't surprised. She must have seen the headlights approaching and slipped away into the night, just like the coward she was. But I had the footage. I had proof that she had been there, standing just beyond my fence, watching my house in the middle of the night like some obsessed stalker. When the officer knocked on my door, I was already waiting with the footage loaded onto my phone. I showed him the grainy, but unmistakable image of Karen near my fence, her posture rigid, her head tilted slightly as if she were studying my house like it was some sort of puzzle she was trying to solve. I told the officer everything, the letters, the previous trespassing incidents, the fake HOA violations, and now this. He nodded as he listened, his expression growing more serious as I laid out every detail. He told me that, while she hadn't technically broken any laws by just standing outside my property, the pattern of harassment was undeniable. He assured me that a formal report would be filed and that they would have a word with Karen. That wasn't enough for me. I was done with warnings, with Karen pushing the limits of the law just enough to avoid direct consequences. I told the officer that I wanted to file for a restraining order. I didn't care if she hadn't crossed the fence this time. I didn't care if she wasn't physically breaking into my home. She was watching, lurking, sending messages, trying to intimidate me in the shadows now that she had lost her position of power. And I wasn't going to wait until she took things further. The officer agreed that, given the history, I had a strong case. He told me to go down to the courthouse first thing in the morning and file for a protective order. That night, I barely slept. I kept an eye on the cameras, waiting, half expecting her to come back, to push further, to make her next move. But she didn't. For the first time in a long time, Karen had been caught in the act, and she knew it. She couldn't claim she was acting on behalf of the HOA anymore. She couldn't say it was all just a misunderstanding. She had been exposed for what she truly was, a bitter, entitled control freak who couldn't stand the fact that I had refused to bow to her authority. The next morning, I did exactly what the officer had suggested. I went to the courthouse, filed for the restraining order, and submitted all the evidence I had gathered over the past several months. The security footage, the letters, the false HOA claims, everything. I wanted it all on record. When I handed over the paperwork, the clerk barely raised an eyebrow, as if she had seen this kind of thing before. That only confirmed what I had already suspected: Karen had probably harassed more people than just me. She had just never been held accountable for it. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I wasn't sure if she would show up or try to weasel her way out of it, but I was ready for whatever happened. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I had been pushed, threatened, and stalked on my own land, but I had never backed down, and I wasn't about to start now. In the days leading up to the hearing, I noticed something different in the neighborhood. Word had spread about what was happening, and for the first time since I had moved in, people started approaching me, not out of curiosity, but out of support. Other homeowners who had been forced to deal with Karen's overreach came forward with their own stories. Some told me how she had pressured them into expensive home renovations just to keep the neighborhood looking uniform. Others revealed that she had used HOA funds for her personal projects, disguising them as community improvements. But the most shocking revelation came from an elderly couple who lived a few streets over. They told me that Karen had once tried to get them evicted from their own home after they had refused to follow one of her absurd policies about the color of their front door. It became clear that I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was standing up against years of unchecked abuse, against an HOA president who had ruled with intimidation and manipulation for far too long. And now, she was finally going to face consequences. The day of the hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom prepared. I had everything organized: the documents, the security footage, the printed letters. When Karen finally entered, she barely glanced in my direction, her usual smugness replaced by something else. Nervousness. She knew she had no real defense. She had lost control of the narrative, and for the first time, she wasn't the one calling the shots. The judge listened carefully as I presented my case. I laid out every incident, every act of harassment, every attempt she had made to interfere with my property. I showed the footage of her trespassing, of her standing outside my fence in the middle of the night, of the damage to my property. I handed over the letters, the false notices, the threats disguised as formal complaints. And when I was done, there was a long silence in the courtroom. Karen tried to defend herself, of course. She tried to claim that she had only been acting in the best interest of the neighborhood, that I was exaggerating, that it had all been a misunderstanding. But the evidence spoke for itself. And the judge saw right through her lies. The ruling was swift. The restraining order was granted, and Karen was officially prohibited from coming near my property, sending me any further communication, or attempting to interfere with my land in any way. Any future violation would result in immediate legal action. But the best part? The judge also ruled that Karen was responsible for the damages to my fence and ordered her to pay restitution. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to send a message. She had lost. As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Peace. Karen had spent months trying to take control of my land, trying to break me down, trying to intimidate me into submission. But in the end, all she had done was destroy herself. A week later, I heard from one of the HOA board members. They told me Karen had officially resigned from the HOA, citing personal reasons. I didn't care why. I was just glad to finally be rid of her. From that day on, I never saw her again. No more letters, no more trespassing, no more absurd attempts to force me into the HOA. She was gone. And for the first time since moving here, I could finally enjoy my property the way I had intended, without interference, without harassment, without anyone trying to take what was mine. I had won. Not just against Karen, but against the idea that people like her could push others around without consequence. I had stood my ground, fought back, and proven that no matter how entitled someone thinks they are, they don't get to take what doesn't belong to them. And as I stood on my land, looking out at the space that was truly mine, I knew one thing for certain. No one would ever take it from me again.